So, as we discussed, Alice will start off by reading two excerpts from the book. And then I'll ask some questions. You might answer my questions.
Face my audience. First of all, I'm overwhelmed, obviously. Thank you very much to my favorite quartet for coming and playing Schubert, my favorite composer. I'm going to read two pieces which I originally wrote, as many sections in this book were written as sort of episodes. As you'll see if you look at the introduction to the book, or the first part, I've been writing this book for 20 years. I started it when I first retired, and I thought I was going to live in pleasant retirement, and then I was offered the job at the Schefter Institute of Jewish Studies, so it was an interruption of several years, and after that my beloved husband asked me to help him with what was actually the jewel in his crown of publishing, which was the comprehensive historical encyclopedia of Jewish women. And I was privileged to work with him on that for almost 5 years. And then, as I also mentioned in the introductory section, I had all the time the most encouraging friends, some of whom I'm happy to say are here, and two of the trio, Sally Gottesman and Mary Ann Stein, have been steady, what should I say, mainstays in my life, profound friends, a profound friendship. And you know, there's a wonderful line in the Schiller, which is the background also of the Beethoven Ninth. He who was blessed, to whom was given the great fortune of being the friend of a friend, eines Freundes Freund zu sein. To have that real relationship where you reciprocity between people. And I've been blessed with a small number, I don't think you can have a very large number of very, very, very close friends, but so close that they have made my life, particularly since Moshe's death, one of great contentment. And it was they, a number of them, but particularly those three, the third one was Barbara Dobkin, who kept on saying, no, when are you going to finish the memoirs? And who really helped me, both spiritually, materially, so that I was able to finish. And the two sections I'm going to read here, I wrote as part of another project. There are a number of people here whom I refer to as my solstice sisters. We're a small group, 7 or 8, how many are we, who meet twice a year on the solstices, in December and in June. And everyone is a creator of some sort. And we bring our creations to each other, hoping that the response will be positive. You never know. One of them is Margaret Wolf, the composer, who set in her opera Fidim Junction, which I think some of you saw, I hope saw and heard, set my letters, the letters of my mother to my father, to music, in a very dramatic and beautiful opera. and another is Carol Sylvester, who's also here, whose creativity lies in creating the most wonderful collection of art. And I think to be a collector also is a form of creation, when you see a kind of central line of appreciation running through that collection, a personal approach that she and her late husband Sam had. Joe Milgram, incomparable artist. I think many of you have seen her work. Genia Markham, who also is just she does things with her hands and she does things with her brain. Nora Gold, a fine novelist who isn't with us tonight because she's in Canada. And it's been very inspirational for me, just as years ago, the Rosh Chodesh group, which again, some of the founders of it are here, Debbie or one of them, we had, each one of us had to bring to that Rosh Chodesh group something we produced, right, or something that we had studied. And I never had anything to bring, so I started writing things in order to have something to bring to the Rosh Chodesh group. So the two sections I'm going to read, actually some of you have heard, and forgive me if you're going to hear them a second time. I chose them because a lot of people, and I think Leslie's going to ask me this as well, I believe, asked me why did you choose that title for your book? What does it mean? And I hope that the two passages, they're actually in sequence in the book, they were not written in sequence, will illuminate to a certain extent why I ultimately, after much threshing of my mind, what am I going to call this book? You know, not My Life and Times, obviously. My Life and Times, another My Life and Times. I hope it will clarify why I ultimately and fairly recently came up with the title. Lacking British nationality when I first went up to Cambridge, I had at the beginning and end of every term to report my arrivals and departures at the local police station. Although the constables who dealt with me were invariably polite, see, this is what I knew was going to happen. My eyes. This is the terrible thing about growing old. Right? The eyes, the ears, I'll go back to that. Although the constables who dealt with me were unfailingly polite, I felt like a criminal on patrol whose lenient sentence might at any time be revoked to be replaced by more severe sanctions. Not until the end of 1946 were my parents and I finally granted British citizenship. I was then able to dispense with my Polish passport. That black document with its gold embossed eagle was at the heart of a minor international incident that occurred in the summer of 1946. For the first time, my parents and I had gone on vacation in Europe. For several reasons, they chose to go to Squal Taras in Switzerland, a spa at which they would be able to take the waters. It had a kosher hotel and lay close to the border with Italy. The last of these factors was the most important, since my parents intended to meet my youngest aunt, Lotte, who had spent most of the war years together with her husband and young son in hiding in Italy. My cousin Alex, serving in the Jewish brigade that steadily worked its way northward after the Allied invasion, had found them in a refugee camp. As soon as possible after the arrival in the Engadine region, we set off on a bus for the Italian border. Our fellow travellers, neighbours who knew each other, chatted away in the local Romanish language, which for us was even less intelligible than Swiss German. One by one, along the route, they alighted as they reached the tiny hamlet or lonely house where they lived. Finally, we were the only passengers. The driver seemed surprised. It was obvious that we were a rare phenomenon. With gestures, he inquired whether we wanted to continue traveling. Perhaps he thought we'd come on a local sightseeing trip. We indicated that we indeed wanted to go on. And so we proceeded to the border. The bus stopped. The driver motioned us to get off, and as soon as we did, turned around and drove off with such alarming speed that I feared he had abandoned us at the sight of an accursed bewitchment. There was nothing but a stretch of barbed wire to indicate that this was the border between Switzerland and Italy. We detected a narrow gap in the wire. Beyond it, a small, unimpressive guard post displayed an Italian flag. A soldier who looked so young that he might have been newly recruited from among the local schoolboys came out of the hut, straightening his disheveled uniform, surprised to see us. With a certain hesitancy, he took his place behind the table that stood near the barbed wire. Without waiting to be asked, we presented our passports. Those of my parents were duly inspected and promptly stamped, but when my turn came, the young soldier scrutinized the opening pages intently, occasionally looking up to see whether my features accorded to the color of the hair and eyes mentioned there. It was, of course, a distorted photo, as passport photos invariably are. Nevertheless, it depicted a face recognizable as mine. Then, parla Italiano? I nodded, hoping against hope that the vocabulary I had acquired at Newnham during the previous summer's course in Dante and Boccaccio would prove adequate. Polacca? He asked. The word was not in my lexicon, but I recalled my parents referring to their non-Jewish neighbors as Polacks. The appellation clearly didn't apply to me. I shook my head. Senaki in Polania? He persisted. Assuming from my momentary hesitation that I hadn't fully understood his previous question. No, I said, pointing to the place of birth in my passport. Essen, Germany. Dunque tu sei tedesca? It was so categorical a statement that I felt considerable embarrassment in contradicting him. No, I was born in Germany, but I'm not German. I'd switched to English, having finally realized that the summer course had not prepared me for altercation with the Italian military. Ah, he said thoughtfully, as if reflecting on what was to all intents and purposes utterly incomprehensible. He switched track. Dove vivi? I live in London, Inghilterra. Ah, so English. He pronounced it with a very long E. English. But I had to disappoint him once again. I was in despair. Slowly pronouncing each word as distinctly as possible, I said sadly, "No, I'm not English. I just live in England." A long silence ensued as he studied the passport, generously granted to my stateless parents by the Polish government in exile, then resident in London. Finally, overwhelmed by the lack of clarity, the contradictory details, he went off to find a more senior official. My parents anxiously waited to see whether I would be allowed to come into Italy with them. The time at which we were to meet my aunt was fast approaching. She would be worried by our non-arrival, fearing some mishap. The officer, resplendent in a light grey uniform sporting a number of ribbons that presumably represented medals, knew no more English than his subordinate, but he wasn't prepared to reveal his ignorance. With an impressive display of self-importance, he too paged through my passport and duly scrutinized both my face and the pages giving essential identifying data. Then, with a smile, he stamped the passport, handed it to me with a courteous bow. "Prego," he said, and added just one more word, "Arrivederci." The second one, which in the book follows immediately afterwards, was not written all at the same time. It's entitled, by the way, that first part I originally entitled Alien. This second section is entitled Inheritance. We set off on a blue-gold Sunday morning with no clear destination, no defined purpose other than to escape from the sun-baked metropolis. A tightly packed carload of young people, freshly minted graduates, enjoying our last summer of freedom before settling down to income-earning responsibilities. We had no specific goal. We had bathing costumes and towels in case we reached the sea. We had an ample supply of fruit and sandwiches. We knew that wherever we went in rural England, we would find a pub to quench our thirst. The South Downs came to mind. Box Hill resonated for those of us who knew Jane Austen's Emma. Never mind, we said, we'll see what crops up. We crossed the Thames and headed southeast, avoiding what was then, in the late 1940s, considered a highway, and choosing instead the less traveled lanes and byways lined with hedges where wildflowers grew. The less traveled lanes and byways surrounding peaceful pastures of calmly grazing sheep and cows, a perfect day for aimless ambling. Suddenly, a signpost with a familiar emblem of the National Trust, Noble House. I gasped in excitement. We have to go there. Willie, who'd been reading some of the same books as me, at once understood. He knew the connection to Virginia Woolf's Orlando. Knowle was the ancestral home of the Sackville West family, the home of whose inheritance Virginia Woolf's lover, Vita, had been deprived only because she was a woman. The loss had been a tragedy for her. Neither my brother nor I had possessed the essential background knowledge when we first read the novel, spellbound by the luscious prose, the twists and turns of plot, the bisexuality of the protagonist, Vita, of course. Knowle was an essential part of Orlando. Now we had a chance of seeing it, of visiting it, and traversing its rooms, courtyards, galleries, and formal gardens. Knowle is a calendar house, 365 rooms, 52 staircases, 12 entrances, 7 courtyards. It is surrounded by 1,000 acres of wooded land, part of it a deer park. At its heart lies the original oldest part of the structure, built in the middle of the 13th century, around which successive generations added layer upon layer of accommodations. The long gallery is lined with portraits of these Sackvilles. Here is, as Virginia Woolf saw, a history of England that covers 4 centuries and more. We came out to the park, sated. 5 young Jews, 3 of us not born in England, the others children or grandchildren of immigrants from Europe. We decided to picnic right there in the inviting shade of an enormous oak whose ample trunk indicated it might well be as old as the house itself. I lay stomach down, my face cradled in my arms. Though it was well after lunchtime, I had no appetite. I breathed in the sweet scent of the grass. It's so unlike that of the London parks. It smelled fresh and untrodden. For the first time in my life, I felt immense envy. Who is wealthy? Asked our ethical fathers, rhetorically replying, he who is happy with his lot. It wasn't true, or at least at that moment it appeared not to be true. What we had seen was true wealth, the wealth not only of property, but of continuity, of knowing not only the names of one's great-grandparents and their forebears, but knowing what they looked like, what they wore, what corridors they traversed, where they mounted their horses, danced to the sounds of the timbrel, made love, being able to visit their graves, pray in the pews in which they prayed, and us. My father had his father's Kiddush cup. My mother lit her Shabbat candles in the candlesticks her mother had brought from Galicia. We had no photographs of the shtetls in which my parents were born. We were fugitives, constantly uprooted, forever on the move. Willie and I even had another tongue that was not the same as that of our parents. Indeed, what was their mother tongue? Yiddish, which their non-Jewish neighbors, both born in the same country, neither spoke nor understood. Polish, to which they resorted when they didn't want us to understand what they were saying, the language of pas devant les enfants. Certainly it wasn't English, which rapidly became my mother tongue after we left Germany, while Willie continued to count in German, to find pleasure in classic and contemporary German literature. Yet he never was and never would describe himself as German. In Germany, we were Ostjuden. From after the Second World War, when we finally attained British citizenship, we were always British, never specifically English. I mystified the guard at the border between England and Italy, a gap in the hedge between beds of tall flowers, through which one glimpsed a vista of a neighbouring room, as in a picture gallery. Its abundant lushness, the vast variety of colours and perfumes, the tranquility, there were very few other visitors, were at once, one at the same time, paradoxically exciting and soothing. And because the creative project of reconstruction and renovation had been undertaken only some 20 years earlier, there was no evocation of a centuries-long family saga. Here was something I could cope with emotionally, though never emulate. A little garden of my own, even a small backyard, a balcony, somewhere where I could tend a few potted plants and where I could be happy with my lot. I really apologize for the bad reading.
Nothing to apologize about. You gave us this beautiful book and we will read it. I wanted to ask you, I read the book, of course, many sleepless nights. It was just so compelling, and there were a lot of parts there that shocked me. And no spoilers, we're not going to make it have any spoilers here, but very, very personal, very revealing. I wanted to ask you how you felt about writing them. It's, in a way, I felt you were going into the marketplace and maybe taking your clothes off, revealing your inner secrets, your inner soul. And I wanted to ask you to talk about that a bit.
Look, something about the history of the book. Originally, what I had tended to write about was not my life, but about the various institutions and organizations in Israel with which I've been privileged to be associated. Beginning with the Hebrew University, where I got my first job, to my surprise in teaching. Let me add parenthetically that when we were asked at Cambridge what we planned to do with our degrees, those of us who'd studied useless things like English literature, I'm ashamed to say that the answer was always anything but teach. Teaching was a despised profession. It took me a long time to realize why, by the way. Right? It was because married women until World War II were not allowed to teach. If you married while you were a teacher, you had to leave the profession. Sounds incredible, right? So all the teachers we ever had were what were referred to as old maids, or spinsters. Well, who at the age of 21 wants to be a spinster, right? And here I found myself with no alternative, as you'll see if you read the book, right? I was offered a teaching job, the only way I could make my way in Israel. And I discovered, of course, that teaching is the most wonderful profession in the world. It is the most satisfying when you see the product of your work. It's like your own children. Like the joy that you have in seeing the result, the harvest of the seeds that you've managed to sow is just incredible. And I know there are many teachers here, and I'm sure you all feel the same way. So the first institution I was involved with, or part of, was the Hebrew University. Very early on, the BA degree had just been founded. So they needed teachers of English as a foreign language. I didn't have a clue about English as a foreign language. As you know, when you're born into a language, and I virtually was born into a language, English, right? You don't know all about what's a verb and what's transitive and what's intransitive. You just don't know the grammar. So I learned at the same, I was always one step ahead of my students. Anyway, the Hebrew University was amazing. It became my life career. I spent 40 years there. So I was writing about that. Then I was writing about an organization called Oil Yosef, with which I became the first community-run organization where the Katamonim, one of the most poverty-stricken and crime-ridden areas in Jerusalem, a group of young men had set up something called Oil Yosef. Again, stories told in the book. Right? And they needed a public committee, and I was asked to head that. And so I had this extraordinary experience of seeing young people recreating or creating new lives for themselves. And that also was an enormous privilege. Right? And then I was asked to set up the English department at Beersheba. So I was part of really creating something new in a new university. The university was unique. It wasn't even a university then. It was called a Machon Universitai, the University Institute. And it was set up jointly by the Hebrew University, Weizmann Institute, and Technion, with the Hebrew University in charge of humanities and social sciences, and the other two clearly science and technology. And suddenly I had the opportunity of creating something new in a new city. Beersheba at that time was not what it is today, right? Not a kind of metropolis. We taught in empty stores. There was no building, there was nothing. But there was enormous enthusiasm. The students were wonderful, as they had been in Jerusalem as well. So I was part of that. And then, of course, the Israel Women's Network, or the lobby, which gave me the chance to do something about the status of women in Israel, and I had wonderful, wonderful colleagues there. Again, I'm happy to see their faces here in the audience. And so one thing after another, what I wanted to write about was really how things develop in Israel. And in that way also to tell the story of my life. I mean, that was what it was supposed to be. And then I needed time in which to do it. And a very, very good friend of mine, John Felsener, who unfortunately died recently, a wonderful professor of English, but also comparative literature, translator from Spanish, suggested that I apply to the Rockefeller Foundation's Institute in Bellagio. This is a paradise. It is incomparable. You're given a room of your own, 2 rooms in my case. You can bring along anybody you want, but not a dog. You get 3 meals a day. Wonderful, right? Up there on the mountain overlooking Lake Como, what a huge estate, almost as big as that of Noel, and with wonderful colleagues who are all creating something. You have to have a project to present. And I've spent the most blissful 30 days there. Your only responsibility is to show up for dinner with your fellows. Well, since they're all wonderful people, that is hardly a punishment. Right? So there in those 4 weeks, you're supplied with paper, with a computer, which I didn't know how to use. I still don't really. Someone was amazed today to see me using a fountain pen. That's where I'm at there. In those 4 weeks, I managed to write 30,000 words. Yeah. And I came back, and then there was Schefter. And then there was another project, and always something else, until finally I felt that I've got to do it. And after Moshe died, and my friends encouraged me, and with the help of my Solstice sisters and my Scottish colleagues, I finally got it done. So, what was your question?
I'm redundant. I'll just sit here and feel beautiful.
Well, those of you who know me know what it's like to have a conversation with me.
I was asking about that part of the book you didn't talk about now, those very personal, private parts where sometimes you don't even give a name, you just give the initials.
So I spoke about only once.
Okay.
Only
one big one.
because he's still alive.
No spoilers.
Yeah, I mean, other people are also alive, but you're written about in a different way. What happened was that once I started writing about what I'd done in my life, you know, it wasn't just about the institutions. It became, well, where do I start? You know, do I start in 1950 when I got the job at the Hebrew University? No, we go back. And how far do you go back? And so I found myself going back to antecedents, my parents, my grandmothers, I never knew my grandfathers, and so on. And it became, I think it's a kind of sharpness, a kind of mixture of autobiography, memoirs. That's not an autobiography, because it, you know, an autobiography I interpret as being, you know, born and then going in a very chronological way to what comes just before death, I suppose. It's memoirs. It's my memories of things, not always in chronological order. Sometimes I go forward, sometimes I go backwards. Here I did, for example, right, 46, 50. And it became what it is today. I mean, it's, and I don't know which is, I hope, that the public part is as interesting as the private, you know? Because the public is told from a very personal point of view. Okay, that's
well, it's
what it is.
I think we all know you're very brave. So I wanted to relate to something that you wrote, and then any questions from the audience. You write about Browning's dramatic monologues, and this is what you write. A sense of failure, of not having reached further than their grasp, of never attaining the ultimate goal. Perhaps these poems resonate so strongly in my mind because I now see them as applying to myself during this formative period of my life. So you're looking back now on those on those monologues, and you haven't attained. I mean, that's the question. I'm not talking about your private life now. I'm talking about what you managed to attain in in the public sphere, your successes. Is this what you feel when you think about those monologues?
Well, this formative period of my life, yes. It's difficult, you know, I mean, yes, but a man's reach should exceed his grasp. You must always go further, or what's the heaven for? I think this has been a pattern in my life of always, oh, Moshe used to scold me so for it, of never, it sounds silly, and it's particularly silly saying it now. I don't think I ever appreciated what I was succeeding in doing. And it's only when I find my actions reflected in the words of my friends, as I did this evening, that I get a sense of worth. I have, believe it or not, a profound inferiority complex. I have. I mean, you know, it's crazy. People, nobody ever believed it, but Moshe knew it. And he tried so hard to talk me out of it. You can't imagine. You can't imagine how often he would say, you may not have published so many books, but you were a good teacher, right? You created other things, right? You set up organizations, you made a school that's turning out the most wonderful pupils and graduates and leaders. So you didn't do X, you didn't do Y, right? Yes, so Browning still resonates, but not as much. Because I think...
Thank goodness.
So, you know, there's reassurance in getting, for example, the Israel Prize, for which my beloved Leslie was largely responsible. I don't know how many of you know how many boxes of material you have to submit in, how many 7 copies? Oh, only 3. Well, she collected cuttings, she collected all sorts of things, this box, and finally, with a change of the Minister of Education to someone who was herself a feminist, right? and I reached the age of 80. That's the other clue. You have to give, if you're getting a lifetime award, which is what I got, my lifetime achievement, then you have to be 80. That's the other thing I got. And that was tremendous, you know. I mean, it was a great honor. It was a great honor. But the greatest reward really is seeing the results of your work, seeing the Israel Women's Network, which was sort of half dead for quite a long time, suddenly come to life again, you know, with renewed vigor, with new people, right, back to what it was at one time. To see several Pellet schools scattered around the country. Right? One for boys. I mean, Pellet means a spindle. And the reason the very clever founders chose that name is because of a really misogynist saying in the Talmud, woman's wisdom is only in the spindle. Okay? Which by those who founded the school interpreters, meaning if you want women's wisdom, it's only a pellet, right? Anyway, now there are lots of pellets, and I see, you know, at least three of my old girls, as we used to call them in England, being rabbis, halachic authorities. What greater satisfaction can there be than that? And to see my children, as I say in the dedication, who have been such wonderful parents, who have been such wonderful grandparents, which makes me very guilty, because I wasn't. And it's that in the book as well. To see another generation, to be now the great-grandmother, as of last week, of 19 great-grandchildren. That was because the last 2 were twins, twin girls. It gives one great happiness, great satisfaction. So I don't know. I still think the Browning applies. No, it doesn't really apply.
Thank goodness. Thank goodness. I promised you that there would be time for a few questions from the audience before we conclude. So, any questions? This is the moment. Anything you wanted to know and don't know yet because you haven't read the book? This is the moment to ask.
It's not compulsory.
Not compulsory. Okay. So I do have a small. Oh yes, there is a question. Yes.
A question.
And thank you. This is a lady who owns the museum and who has created this wonderful place, which you should all visit properly.
Well, about time you got to that. My question Oh, excuse me. When do we see the sequel? I want you to know, seriously, I was very moved by most of the things you said, mostly ones I understood. But I'm going through the battle of preparing one of those and reaching your age. Not too far from it at all. And I understand what you've gone through, and it is such an enormous upheaval in oneself to come up with all the things that you want to say and need to say, and all the things that you've done and accomplished are so important that they must be said. And congratulations, and my warmest affection.
Alice said that the amount of material that she couldn't put into the book, she could make another one, write another one. So here's the challenge.
Another book?
Yes, another one. Sequel. All the things that didn't go into the first
Yes,
one.
well, I keep on. I'm sort of continuing writing on and off. I'm doing other things as well. Like giving up my beloved library for the second time in my life. Once when I stopped teaching English literature and had to give up all my very, very wealthy collection of English literature. And one of my former pupils, who became my colleague, Elizabeth, took one set, right, Bullets, the narrative and dramatic sources of Shakespeare. And one day she phoned me and said, you know, coming across your marginal notes, your teacher's marginal notes, so wonderful. Thank you, my dear. That, you see, that is the great thing, the satisfaction of seeing where it's like your pupils, your students are, of seeing where your children are, where your grandchildren are. As I say, the reaping of the harvest. Tomorrow, please God, will be my 92nd birthday.
All my surprises. Elisheva, the wonderful Elisheva.
The one and only Elisheva. Here, even though she's here. So, thank you, Elisheva. Did you make it? Is this part of, because she's now taking a course in pastry making. Perhaps this was already part of it.
So, since we're not permitted to eat the cake now, when you leave, there'll be a slice waiting for you in the exit, even if you don't have a book to show. But if you haven't bought a book and you still want to buy it, you can get it outside. If you want the book autographed and you haven't had it autographed, then just come up to here with your book and Alice will be autographing the books right over here. I want to thank everybody who was involved in this evening, and a special thanks to Martine and Paul Holborn for enabling.
I have to say this.
I'm redundant.
No, I have to say this. No. Always the acknowledgements which you write at the end. I don't think anybody could have had better, more understanding, more encouraging, dedicated publishers than I've had good fortune. Martine Halber is also the finest editor I've ever encountered, apart from Paula Hyman, who had edited the Comprehensive Historical Encyclopedia of Jewish Women, who would write back to me when I was doing copying. I think that at the bottom of page 56, there should be a comma after. great scholar. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alice, for the book. Will you autograph mine? Will you autograph mine?